and most of us on this call, there are hundreds of people here this evening that are from Scotland, have been in equal parts inspiring as well as deeply worrying. Last night, Donald Trump announced what can only be described as not just an attack on the American Constitution, but on democracy and on the right to protest. And this on the back of yet another case of police brutality, of murder, and it's part of a long history of oppression in the United States. And of course, it's not just in the United States where we see this happen. Right across the world, people are beginning to realise that the society in which they live has injustice at its very root. And the movement that we've seen emerge in America has given everyone across the world who is paying attention lots to think about and lots to consider as we move forward from the pandemic. What we've tried to do this evening is to bring together a group of speakers who can tell us about the situation on the ground in the United States. We've been reading media reports, articles, we've been seeing social media videos, but we felt here at coauthor that it was vital that we heard from people who are part of the movement, who are organisers, and who have been part of this movement, not just in recent weeks, but indeed for decades, because this is a struggle that is having to be fought again and again. I'm going to just introduce each speaker in turn, and I want to say that on behalf of coauthor, we are really pleased, but also really appreciative of the time that is being given up by each of the speakers this evening. These are very busy people. They are in the thick of what is happening right now in the United States and elsewhere, and so we appreciate their time. The first speaker I'd like to introduce is Rose Brewer. Rose is a teacher, a long-time activist in the Black freedom struggle based in Minneapolis. She's been involved in building political organisations against police violence and was a co-author of the Black Lives Matter 2017 report, A Vision for Black Lives. I'm going to pass over now to Rose so that we can hear what's been going on in Minneapolis and what the objectives are moving forward, and also possibly about how we in Scotland can help. Please welcome Rose.
Thank you, Jonathan. Is my voice okay? Can you hear me? Great. Thanks for the invitation in this very tumultuous period. This is an important conversation, and looking forward to sharing insights and possibilities, and of course, solidarity as we move forward. I am a longtime activist, leftist, organizer, as well as teacher. And I will say, from my perspective, there is no after Ferguson. If you remember 2014 and the murder of Mike Brown here in the US in Ferguson, Missouri. Since that time, in the last several years, there have been numerous killings of Black people. And now we have the murder of George Floyd here in Minneapolis, Minnesota. It's happening in the wake of seemingly endless Black deaths by police. The issues, of course, are structural, national, systemic, white supremacist, global capitalist. So there is a profound urgency to this moment. It's the culmination of a long durée of police misconduct that has often gone unnamed and certainly has gone unchecked. I want to divide my remarks into some general framing. For those of you who know little about the state of Minnesota and the cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul, I want to get a bit into that history and our relationship to the police, and then roll out what's actually happening here at this moment both at the national level as well as the local level, with an emphasis on what we're doing here locally. I will say, in terms of general remarks, that the wounds are deep here in our cities, and we are certainly committed to fundamental social transformation. I've been in these cities long enough and struggled continuously enough to understand and to share the deep sorrow of our community at the hands of the police murder of Mr. George Floyd. So the stakes are high for us, and the necessity of fundamental social change is not in the least bit contestable. For us, it means identifying root causes. What about a system of power and deeply rooted social dispossession that underpin the race, class, and gender realities of Minneapolis? In the wake of the Ferguson death of Michael Brown and the subsequent murders of Eric Garner and the long list of others, Black men, women, and children, gender nonconforming migrants, this is what we're dealing with, and this is what we have to contend to change. So what does racism, white supremacy mean in 21st century Minneapolis? When self-interest and social interest are so aligned with whiteness that this is intractable ground, when institutionalized practices are so resistant to change, racism part of the very fiber, warp, and sinews of everyday life, the normalized, taken for granted world, these are the underpinnings for our demand for radical social change as an imperative. Certainly, it also means in 21st century US, holding in check a population of people who threaten or potentially threaten property, where communities become dumping grounds for guns that are not made here, drugs that are imported, and locked out of education, employment, housing. This is in one of the most, quote, liberal states in the US, when deep levels of disrespect and inhumanity are business as usual. This is what we're contending with. Concretely, central to our organizing and to our resistance, of course, at its heart are the police murders and police violence, but also issues of economic dispossession, homelessness, and the list goes on. Police brutality and murder is heinous, but state violence that makes Black life not matter is the core. It negates the fundamental human rights, the social rights of food, shelter, schooling, safety. For those of you who know little of Minnesota, I wouldn't expect many of you to know much about it. I will try to sort through a bit of the history. We are actually on Dakota land, indigenous lands. The Dakota Wars happened, so-called Dakota Wars, but it was the US wars against the Dakota people 150 or so years ago. And that was earmarked a few years ago. The Dakota were forcibly removed, genocide applied, and the state was founded in that context. Although not officially a slave state, had ties to the slaveocracy in the South, with some of those slaveholders coming to the state and also offering financial support as the state was getting off the ground, leading up to the Civil War in 1861. Certainly by the turn of the 20th century and the establishment of and formation of the state of Minnesota and the cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul, we know that by 1922, in the police department in the city of Minneapolis, there was a visible Klan presence, Ku Klux Klan, meaning white supremacists who carried out policing in the cities. So racism as well as anti-Semitism runs deep in that history. That line of white nationalist, white supremacist presence goes a long way to explaining the subsequent history of police violence. I arrived in the state in the late 80s, around 1990, when the murder of a young man, a young Black man, actually a teenager named Tysel Nelson occurred. He was shot in the back by a white police officer, and the community organized and demanded justice for Tysel. Of course, justice did not occur. And subsequently, there were a number of such murders. The ones that are most recent that you may be aware of include the police killing of Jamar Clark and the more recent murder of Philando Castile. And because his partner videotaped that action, it spread broadly, nationally, and I'm assuming internationally. It was in the context of the Jamar Clark murder in 2015 that many of the organizers that are now on the ground in Minneapolis got their sea legs. They were very young organizers at the time, and actually took over what is known as the 4th Precinct, which is on the north side of Minneapolis. The Floyd murder happened on the south side. The city is cut through by another abomination, ran through the neighborhoods and the community of Rondo, which is in St. Paul. This is a interstate highway which cut through all the way to the north side to bring white suburbanites into the city easily. And the north side is actually the side with a fairly substantial concentrated number of Black community people. And so the Black Visions Collective, at that time, Black Lives Matter, took over the 4th Precinct to demand justice for Jamar Clark. And as I said, cut their teeth on commandeering space, on what I would call political mutual aid. And many of those skills are now being deployed. I'll say more about those later. The state torpedoed the takeover and reclaimed that land and space, which had actually been a community center before the 4th Precinct took it over. But in the wake of that, not even 2 years later, was the police killing of Philando Castile. That happened right outside of St. Paul in a space that very similar to what happened in Ferguson, used the racial profiling of Black people. Actually, Philando Castile had been arrested or at least stopped at least 50 times for various and sundry so-called issues. And in fact, was stopped for so-called broken tail light when his murder happened. He was legally permitted to carry a weapon and indicated that, which made no difference. And he was shot on the spot with his partner and her 4-year-old daughter in the space. And she recorded that. The point about that murder and the context for understanding what's going on now is that small space right outside of St. Paul had used the profiling to fill its coffers with tickets and stops. And this is something that had happened in Ferguson, that Black folk were targeted, stopped, and the fines that were levied were used to fund the departments, which is another feature of police injustice, violence that you should understand. That case, of course, ended with the firing of the officer who killed him, no justice, and definitely no peace. And now we are here in 2020. Mr. Floyd in my Southside neighborhood went into a store, Cup Food, which is a grocery store that serves that community, or our community, off of 38th in Chicago, which is really a main thoroughfare for Black and Brown and other folk. It has also an ugly racialized history, including restricted covenants back in the day, which prevented Black people from moving in. And there's been a historic contestation around that. One of the more recent demands has been to remove all restricted covenants, which sound like a Southern phenomenon, but actually have been in play here. At any rate, it's now predominantly Black and Brown and some whites. There's probably not a place in Minneapolis there isn't a white presence. It's a state with over 80% of the population being white. The Twin Cities and Minneapolis has the highest concentration of the Black community in the state of Minnesota. So he goes into Cup, and merchant called the police saying that he was trying to pass a counterfeit bill to buy something, I don't remember what. That's when they came, no fair assessment of whether this was a righteous claim or not. He was immediately thrown, no question asked, into the police car. It's difficult to see when he actually hit the ground, but was removed from the car, from my understanding, and thrown to the ground. And then that infamous tape that has gone all over the world. I don't even want to re-victimize Mr. Floyd by addressing it, but he was literally with a knee on his neck, smothered to death, killed, calling out that he couldn't breathe, and for his mother. An atrocious, horrific death and murder, with people pleading with the police to stop, and of course didn't. In the wake of that, obviously the insenseness, the senselessness, and we kicked in to motion around organizing. This happened on Memorial Day, what we call Memorial Day here, May 31st. And the protest kicked off. This becomes a bit more complex around who's at the bottom of the protest, of the resistance. But the usual powers that be, of course, kicked in with folk like Al Sharpton coming in and the preachers coming in. And this is a recurrent kind of containment level of social control that has worked well for power elites. But there was already organizing from the bottom up on the ground, and putting in place the political mutual aid. People, of course, were getting roughed up and harmed and threats. And what you've seen over the past week has been the uprising, certainly righteously from the bottom up for many folk, but there are also very damning social forces in the mix. We know from the takeover of the 4th Precinct in 2015 that white supremacist actions, as a matter of fact, at that protest, community people, young Black men were shot by white supremacist actors. So it's not anybody's imagination. We've tracked this. We know that they're in the mix. We don't burn down our libraries. That's a sacred space. Our children love that. If you listen, and I hope you don't, to anything Donald Trump says, please do not take his assessment of who is responsible. The signals that he's signaling out to his base, the travesty already within the Minneapolis Police Department. It is a very dangerous situation here. We are under occupation. The troops, the National Guard troops, the full detainment of those troops has happened. I'm not sure where the governor is going to take it from this point on. And then yesterday's comments by Donald Trump. It's a very delicate, dangerous space, not only here, but all over this country. In deep solidarity, our comrades from all over the country have joined in solidarity for this travesty, and also more deeply for the travesty of racialized capitalism in this country and what it's meant for Black people, for what it's meant for poor and working class people, what it's meant for so many people in the context of a COVID pandemic that's hit the Navajo Nation very hard, that's hit disproportionately Black folk. And here we are. Having said that, we are in the long fight. We are seizing the time as much as we can. We know very clearly and known for a long time, there has to be deep transformational change in this society, not only for us to breathe, but for the world to breathe in the context of this empire, in the context of imperialism, in the context of the violence that has been perpetuated against Black people for 400 years. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Rose. That gave, I think, everyone a real insight into the situation ongoing, but also the kind of historic context of it as well. We are going to do in the movement in Scotland everything that we possibly can to provide support and solidarity, because it's one of the many things that we need to do. But the more international pressure there is on the US regime, the more likely it is that we can provide some real support and some real solidarity that can make at least some kind of an impact. The next speaker that I have a great honour in introducing is someone who is also showing solidarity with the movement taking place in the United States, and doing so in a very important way, doing so through the labour movement and through the trade union movement. Everyone who has any awareness of how we must go about social change understands the importance of bringing in workers, bringing in the labour movement, and maximising the forces that we have. Adam Burch is a bus driver and a rank and file member of the Amalgamated Transit Union, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce Adam, and once again to thank him for his time. We really do appreciate it, and I'll now hand over to you, Adam. Just wait a sec. You may be muted, Adam. There we go. We're not hearing you at the present moment, but just give it a second or two.
Let me try this.
That's us. We've got you now.
Okay. All right. I was trying to use my headphones, but apparently that doesn't work.
Thank you, Adam. We've got you loud and clear. Thank you.
I'm going to stop the video too. But I tried to show that, I'm calling you from 38th in Chicago, as Rose referred to, the intersection where unfortunately George Floyd was brutally murdered. It's a really great honor, and I do appreciate the invitation to speak to this group. It's also an honor to be included in the same list of speakers as Rose, and it's always good to hear from her. I was hoping to show maybe a little bit of the continuous occupation here at 38 in Chicago, but there continues to be just music and food, and people and there's just a continuous occupation and just a celebration of George Floyd's life, but also a determination to actually get justice. I mean, there's very strong demands that are coming out of the protest here. One of the frequent slogans is "One down, three to go," which is referring to all 4 police officers that were involved in the murder of George Floyd. Only the one officer, Derek Chauvin, has been charged and arrested, but the movement is not satisfied with that. It wants to go even further. Just a little bit about kind of how, and again, I didn't mention, but again, I think it's really important that this movement is international. So I really do appreciate particularly trade union activists to show solidarity with the movement. The working class is international, so our movements should be as well. So, like Rose said, there has been just a long history of police brutality, not just in the U.S., but just right here in the Twin Cities area. Another thing that I would just emphasize that provides an idea of just the overall context, which everybody is always aware of, but I think it plays a big role, is that we are in the middle of one of the worst recessions in anybody's living memory. We are experiencing not just a economic crisis, but of course we still continue to suffer from a pandemic, healthcare crisis, and the political establishment has already before the moments of George Floyd a week ago or so had already demonstrated its complete failure to address either of those crises. And so there's just an overall polarization, I think, in society right now that's very stark. And I think all this kind of, as long with the pandemic, with the recession, with a long history of police brutality, has all kind of built up into what I would describe as a powder keg. And something like the murder of George Floyd was only the spark that was needed to really explode American society right now into a very volatile situation, more so than I've ever experienced myself. And I just want to emphasize too that, like, just to speak on again, like the economic component of this is that a lot of these police murders, including this most recent one, the pretext for it was a situation of, you know, working class poverty and precariousness. You know, the check or the forged bill or the counterfeit bill or whatever it was for $20. We should remember Eric Gardner in 2014 in New York City. The pretext for him being approached by police officers was him selling loose cigarettes. I think we should also remember like Alton Sterling in Louisiana around the same time as the Philando Castile murder was selling bootleg CDs or DVDs. Then yeah, like Rose mentioned, Philando Castile was approached because of a broken taillight. So I think this all kind of speaks to the fact that like the police system and the state overall preys on working class people, working class poor, and particularly disproportionately people of color. And of course, the real criminals, the Wall Street barons who created this massive recession, this job loss, the cut in wages, the more precariousness of our jobs, the real fraud, the real to, you know, the tune of billions and billions of dollars. Those real criminals don't be held account. And so I guess I should get into more specifically on what the role of unions have been during this. So on well, first I should say during the Philando Castile, I mean, I was involved here in the Jamar Clark occupation of the 4th precinct, but I only really participated but during the Philando Castile occupation of the governor's mansion. A group of us there decided to take the highway on I-94 and shut down the highway. I was involved in that, and I was arrested in the way that the Twin Cities Police Department's make arrest is that they take people on a bus and take them to jail. So I had experience with that, and so when I was, so now I'm a bus driver myself, and so when I when I was driving my regular route on Wednesday, I got a message over the way that transit control communicates with buses that said that we needed, or that the police department needed a police bus, and I knew that was probably the signal, all I needed to know that the police department was about to prepare for mass arrest. And so I made just a quick post on Facebook during my next break and layover, and that got a lot of, to the effect of, like, you know, as a worker and as a union member, you know, I refuse to take my class to jail. I refuse to take the radical youth to jail who are protesting the murder of George Floyd, a protest that I think is completely justified, that I'm in complete solidarity with. So I will not use my labor to cut across that movement. It got a lot of reactions, got a lot of like posts or reposts, and I translated that into a petition, to an online petition, and linked that to a Facebook group. The next day at work, I circulated it to my coworkers that I came in contact with, and a lot of coworkers were unwilling to help the same police department that murdered George Floyd. They were unwilling to put themselves at danger, let alone for a police department that created all this mess to begin with. It has since it's since reached a broader layer beyond just transit workers. A lot of letter carriers, nurses, teachers are now involved in the struggle. The teachers actually here in Minneapolis are trying to move forward their campaign to kick out Minneapolis Police Department of their schools. So it's just another example of unions using their position to fight for the broader Black liberation movement. And since then, it's obviously spread beyond Minneapolis. My local 1005 put out a very strong statement and saw in solidarity with the movement. But ATU International, so my international, also put out a strong statement, but went but added even further that indeed the petition that it didn't mention in my exact petition, but it did take up a lot of the language that I used. That this is that transit workers and transit agencies should not be used to take protesters to jail. Should not be used to transport police. This is a misuse of public transit, and so any ATU member has the right to refuse any of this work, because not only is it a misuse of public transportation, but it has the potential to put workers at risk. And so another transit workers union, which is the Transit Workers Union, TWU, which also represents a lot of transit workers across the country in very big cities, obviously including New York City. So TWU Local 100 had one of its members during a protest in Brooklyn, New York, walk off the bus at the site of the protest as protesters were getting loaded on to his bus to take to jail. Walked off the bus in solidarity with the movement, which created a very powerful statement. And so very soon after that, TW Local 100 again put out a very strong statement condemning this use of public transit. And so since then, we've been able to really kind of like build this Facebook page and build a number of union activists around this petition. I've been able to use it as an organizing tool to talk to my coworkers, but also we organized a labor contingent on Saturday, where we had a number of speakers that are union members. This is a short program before we marched, or on the and were included in the bigger protest that day on Saturday. Included was my shop steward, so I was able to get my shop steward to come out to protest, who is a member of the Black Caucus in our local 1005. Also, we got another shop steward to come out, and he made a very powerful speech. And he's the president of our local 1005 Black Caucus. The overall president of local 1005 is also very involved. His name is Ryan Timlin. He's also very involved in these overall movements and in our considered effort to really build labor solidarity around justice for George Floyd. And so I think it's really important just to kind of like to remember the role that unions should be playing, and why I think it's important that unions get involved. I think you know, unions are the working class organizations. It is the collective bargaining unit of workers, and so it's the best defense against the bosses. It's the best defense against corporate attacks on working people. And when unions were their strongest, I think everybody's probably aware that unions everywhere aren't as strong now as they were, and that's definitely particularly the case in the U.S. But when unions were their strongest is when they were involved in the civil rights movement. It's when they took up campaigns around housing and fought for tenants' rights. This shows that like unions can play a role as the most progressive force in society, to fight for the entire working class, and not just for their immediate membership interests and the narrow confines of the workplace. And so I think it's really exciting that so far we've seen a willingness from a section of the labor movement to really throw their weight behind doing what they can to build the overall social movement here for justice for George Floyd. And we want to continue to build that up as much as possible. And so I think a big part of that is moving towards an international contingent of unions that want to show solidarity. So I think this call and the participation here is very important, and I'm honored to be a part of it. So I look forward to continue to build with you all. So thank you.
Thanks very much for that, Adam. The initiative which you showed in relation to the protests that are taking place there, and other trade unionists have taken throughout the last days, has had an international impact. The London Tube, for example, there was a picture that went viral of a homemade sign put on the front of a London Tube that said that it was standing in solidarity with the movement in the United States. And we also want to use this meeting not only to hear what's going on, but to act in a way that can help to develop the movement. So on that basis, maybe after this call in the days ahead, we'll be in contact with you to try and build links with the trade union movement in Scotland and your branch, and let's see what we can develop. It's inspirational to hear about what you and others have done there, and not just inspirational, indeed it's vital in terms of developing the movement and opposing the authoritarianism of Trump and everything that goes with it. At this point, I just want to say that there are two organisations which we are urging people, if they can, to make a donation to. We have checked that these organisations are not just legitimate organisations, but they are doing exceedingly important work on the ground. We know that because we've spoken to people who are part of these organisations. One is the Black Visions Collective, which is at www.blackvisionsn.org, and the other one, Reclaim the Black. That's reclaimtheblack.org. Everything that I have said in relation to that will be put in an email to everyone who's on this call, and you'll receive that after this meeting. You'll also see that on our social media as well. We want to give all the support we can. That's building links, taking action here, but it's also doing what we can to supply financial resources to those on the front lines of the struggle at the present moment. And on that, I'm going to say just a little about after our speakers are finished, about what we want to do to take this forward. I'm going to introduce now a speaker who many of you will have heard of before. It's someone who has played a very prominent role in the anti-racist movement in Scotland. It's someone who himself has been the victim of police brutality as well. We are going to also hear from Callie Akuno, who's on an emergency call just now. So I'm going to bring forward Amar Anwar, a human rights lawyer, a long-standing campaigner against racism, to give some Scottish context to our discussions that can help us to move forward in a manner which can best build solidarity, not just with the movement in the United States, but with the anti-racism movement here in Scotland as well. Welcome, Amar, to the meeting.
Thanks, Jonathan, and thank you for organising the meeting. Just starting off, but I'm just conscious that there's so many speakers, so one thing that struck me was the compare and contrast that has taken place as a result of George Floyd's killing, as a result of his murder, and people sort of saying, oh, I mean, all day today in the last few days I've had journalists non-stop saying, well, we don't really have the same problem in Scotland, and that happens time and time again, and it's happened in Scotland. I've been in Scotland for some 33 years. I was brought up in Liverpool, and in Liverpool, of course, we were brought up with the stories of black males dying in the back of police vans. We had the riots, we had the uprising, where, like, on, you know, in the streets of Minneapolis and other cities across the United States, you know, young people rose up and their communities rose up to fight back against the racist police force that for generations had killed and murdered black people on the streets with little or no accountability. Now, in Scotland, we have watched this and often said there's a myth that exists that racism does not really exist up here, and this is being constantly perpetuated. Before, it used to be a case of, well, we don't have black people in Scotland. The predominant population in Scotland was of Pakistani origin and Asian origin, but of course now we have many communities from across the world since 2000. But the problems still exist. I mean, if you take it back, you mentioned, I'm very conscious of the fact that this has struck really home, because I spent, it's impossible if you're from a person of color not to be struck by what's going on in the United States. It's impossible not to be angry. It's impossible not to want to scream at the TV screen, to be glued to your social media until the early hours, watching the attack after attack taking place. I'm feeling almost helpless, especially for a demonstration. My teeth were smashed out, and what always remained with me is that when I looked up as a young 21-year-old, asking the question why, teeth smashed out, blood pouring from my face, terrified, thinking I was going to be one of those young men from Liverpool dying in the black of the police van, and the police officers, before they kicked me in the
Obviously, just a bit of a connection issue, but yeah, I think we should just be patient and just wait for Amar to come back.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we've got you now, Amar.
Yeah. Yeah, I was just saying that when I was attacked by the police and my teeth were smashed, I asked the question why, and they said, this is what happens to black boys with big mouths. And in that 4.5 years that followed since then, I became a radical anti-racist campaigner. I was on the streets, I demonstrated, I took part in riots, I hated the police with a passion. I saw their violence time and time again. When those 4.5 years that it took me to get the case to court, I was arrested over 20 odd times. I had several court trials, and each and every occasion I was sworn at, I was given racial abuse, and I was told to give up and walk away. And I eventually won my case against the police. I won a civil action, but nothing happened to those police officers. There was no justice. They weren't suspended. They were suspended for 6 months on full play, and then they were put back on the beat. And they were never arrested. They never faced trial. I won my civil action, and I then went on to become a lawyer. And those years since that have followed, I've seen racist murders take place in Scotland, which are denied the fact that they're racial. We had the Surjit Singh Choka murder, for example, some back in 1998, which again took 3 trials, a change in the law, a denial of the racial motivation. 3 white men who were racist who carried out the attack and murdered him on the street outside his girlfriend's house. And we had the first trial where only 1 man was tried. We then kicked off a campaign with the support of the trade union movement. The whole trade union movement in Scotland came behind us. It was in the aftermath of the Stephen Lawrence murder inquiry coming out. And again, we had a second trial. And then in the second trial, the other 2 men walked free. And then there was a form of an inquiry, which was a whitewash, but had to accept that institutional racism existed in Scotland. That was back in 2000. And then the father of Surjit Singh Chokha, the Asian boy that was killed, became ill with cancer, and we gave up the campaign. And then many years later, we fought for the law to be changed. And then some 2-3 years ago, we went back to court, successfully prosecuting the racist killer of Surjit Singh Chokha. And then people thought, oh, well, things have changed for the better. But then people forgot. And as I stood on the steps of the court, talking about, families in the midst of their grief, having to campaign against racism, having to have their voices heard, the voice of the voiceless having to be heard. Voice of the voiceless used to be a slogan of, the civil rights movement during the 1950s and the 1960s. And I said, remember Sheku Bayo. It's almost as though there was like what we have in Scotland and in the United Kingdom and other countries is worthy victims and victims who are not worthy. But that happens time and time again to black men that are murdered on the streets, that black men who are killed on the streets, or black men who die in police custody. Because what happened with Sheku Bayo was that he was a 31-year-old gas engineer who was a father of 2, originally from Sierra Leone, who came to this country, I believe, when he was about 12 years old. He moved from London to Scotland because his family thought it was safer for him to be in Scotland than to be a young black male in the streets of London. And he came to stay with his sister and their family. And he moved up here. And at the age of 31, on May the 3rd, 2015, he was walking down the street. And police had received reports of a black male acting erratically with a knife. He hadn't attacked anyone, but at about 7:30 in the morning. And several police vehicles were dispatched, a total of 9 police officers. And the first police officers to arrive, and I'll call them Officer A and Officer B, arrived. They accelerated their vehicle at Sheku Bayo. They jumped out of the vehicle. And when Sheku was walking towards them, he had his open palms. He was wearing a white t-shirt. It was 7:30 in the morning. He had no knife on him. He did not brandish a knife, but instead, what happens then is Sheku does nothing. He does absolutely nothing. We understood later he was under the influence of drugs and he may have been hallucinating, but whatever it was, he displayed no violence, no aggression towards them. And he was attacked by the first officer with CS spray, and then another officer with powder spray. He was then baton charged, and then the other 2 officers arrived, and a third one used baton spray and potentially also CS spray. And then the 4th officer, a female officer, who said she feared for her life, so she took out the baton to use on Sheku Bayo, a man who kept trying to walk away from the violence of the police. And this woman, and I know as a criminal defense lawyer, we are always told in defense that it's not self-defense to attack someone when they are walking away from you. Sheku Bayo had his back to her and she tried to attack. And it was at that instance that this police officer, there was some form of a skirmish. We don't know exactly what, but the point is the policewoman allegedly went down and Sheku Bayo was supposed to have attacked her. But all we know is that within less than half a minute of 4 of those police officers, Sheku Bayo was face down on the ground and had the first officer who weighed 25 stones on top of him, a second officer who weighed another 25 stones on top of him, and within the space of a minute, several more officers were on top of him, holding him down, cuffing him, ankle restraints, leg restraints, using a baton to hold him down, using force, breaking a rib, 54 separate injuries, losing consciousness and not able to breathe. And the words that he used when people turn around to us and say, we don't have this in Scotland, is that Sheku says, I can't breathe. They couldn't find a knife on him. He had no weapon on him. He was restrained and they still would not let him go. So when I watched George Floyd taking his last breaths and struggling to breathe like any normal human being would if they were being lent on positional asphyxiation, which all police officers around the world are trained to do. And when I saw that, it reminded me of Sheku Bayo. It reminded his sister. It reminded his family. It reminded his partner, Colette Bell, who has Isaac, her son. It reminded them exactly of what happened to Sheku in that morning. The only difference was this, that Sheku had probably a minimum of 6 officers holding him down, and he lost his life. He was never able to get off. And what happened was the policewoman, of course, was sent to the hospital. She was released from the hospital within 30 minutes. She joined her fellow officers in the police station. Those police officers refused to give a statement to their senior officers. They refused to give a statement to the so-called independent investigators of the Burch. And what happened was those 9 officers sat in a police station in Kirkcaldy in the comfort of their own canteen and able to converse and able to speak to each other whilst denying any statements for 32 days to any outside bodies. But within an hour of Sheku dying and losing his life, the message that was being sent out through police sources was that they had attacked and brandished a knife, used a machete on police officers. His family were told that he had attacked the police officers, that he had used a knife. Local politicians were told that, and of course the story began to be molded for him to be stigmatized and to be stereotyped and then to be attacked in such a way. And the family were forced to set up a campaign in the midst of their grief, as all families are, having to take on the authorities, the police, etc. And they placed their trust in our Crown prosecution that they would do their job and do their duty and that those officers would face justice. 5 years later, that family were told that not a single officer would be facing any charges. Not a single charge, not a charge of murder, not the charge of culpable homicide, not the charge of serious assault, not the charge of assault, not the charge of attempt to pervert the course of justice, no health and safety charges, and no prosecution of Police Scotland. And of course, we then began the campaign for a public inquiry, which is due to take place once the COVID-19 regulation or COVID-19 situation disperses. But the reality is this, that it hasn't gone away. And this is what I despair about, and this is what makes me so angry. Because when I see the great and the good on social media, and I see them on the TV, and I see the statements being said, and it spreads wide and far, standing in solidarity with George Floyd, standing in solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States. And I check through their timeline, and I look to see what they said on the 3rd of May 2015, in 2016, 17, 18, 19, and 20 about Sheku Bayo. It is abject silence. And that silence is complicity in racism, it's complicity in peace violence, and the lack of accountability and transparency that doesn't just exist in the United States, but exists in this country. Since 1969, in the United Kingdom, we have had 3,000 deaths in police custody. Since then, since 1969, not a single police officer in the United Kingdom has been successfully prosecuted for homicide. 1,500 deaths since 1990. Not a single police officer successfully prosecuted. That is the reality of a lack of accountability, of transparency, and police racism. The fact that also the large proportion of those deaths happen to be Black, Asian, minority, ethnic members of the community. And I think when you can connect that all up, the question we should be asking is, that it seems to be easy for people to talk about what happens in the United States and racism. Why, if they want to fight racism in the United States, if they want to fight for justice in the United States, what about what's happening in Scotland? And you can probably tell I am extremely angry, because let me also tell you this, as everybody is opening the coffers and their money and putting quite rightly money into the bail funds in Minnesota and all these other places, I asked the question, what do you think happens to families in this country when they lose their loved ones at the hands of the police? They take on the Police Federation, they take on Police Scotland, they take on the Crown Office, they take on the independent investigations, they take on the government, and they do so without a single penny of legal aid funding. We have fought for 5 years with nothing. Hundreds of thousands of pounds of cost and not a penny in our direction. Because Sheku Bayo, of course, was criminalized. He was stereotyped and he wasn't a worthy victim, but he had the right to life. He did not deserve to die. And to be silent in all of this about Sheku Bayo is actually to join in the complicity. Because if you justify Sheku Bayo's death and fail to speak up, then you are in reality part of the problem. You justify George Floyd, you justify David McAtee that was killed yesterday, and surprise, surprise, the cameras, the camcorders weren't working, in that place where David McAtee, a member of the community who runs a barbecue and actually used to feed police officers for free, was killed last night in the United States. So that's a summing up of the Sheku Bayo case. And I think that in terms of, a lot of people are asking me and tweeting and texting and stuff saying, what can we do? I'll say this: if you want to fight racism, if you want to fight justice in the United States, and you also start on your home territory, and we have a battle ahead, and I've seen this time and time again, because it is tiring. It is so tiring and so galling to families and loved ones of victims to have to set up campaigns themselves. And this also applies to the left, right? I also have a criticism for the left, because it's okay when things like this happen. And then we can go through for months and weeks going to meetings where nobody attends, going to demonstrations where little or nothing is said, having to raise funds or put hands in our own pockets to be able to take on a police force that had funding for every single police officer, 9 police officers with QCs, the police federation with QCs, you know, the PERC with their own lawyers and all that. They array the whole state against you to shut you down. You know, they put the stories out. We've seen it in this country with the shootings and the killings of Jean-Charles de Menezes, of Mark Duggan, of case after case after case, where justification is done because what they know is this: if you can criminalize a black man in his death, if you can stereotype him, then it takes away the public sympathy, because they only want worthy victims. That's the only time you'll see politicians and the media and the great and the good stand up and say, well, that's okay. And actually, we've seen that with George Floyd, because there was a real attempt to criminalize him in his death. And people turned around and said, yes, George Floyd did go to prison. George Floyd did have a past, but he changed his life, because 10 years after going to prison, 10 years ago, he went to prison and he spent time inside. But that wasn't a death sentence. He didn't deserve a death sentence, police. And in fact, the police didn't even know his record, because for over 10 years, he tried to change his life. He tried to change it for the better. He tried to help people in his community. He had absolutely every right to life. And I despair, because when I look at this case and you see one person being prosecuted, right? But you already have the chief prosecutor putting out what they also did in Scotland, a justification for his death, that he had underlying conditions. And I ask this: in each and every death of every black person or minority ethnic person, whether it be in the United Kingdom, whether it be in the United States, why is it that every time a black person dies at the hand of the police, there's an underlying condition, or it's excited delirium, which is what we heard? And I looked that time up when they said it about Sheku Bayo. And basically what it means is a black person excites himself to death. It's because of him. And the question we should ask time and time and time again, every time a person dies in police custody, is, would that person still be alive had it not been for the intervention of the police? And 99.9% of the time, the answer is yes. And if it's yes, then the police should face justice, and they should face justice for murder or culpable homicide. And when only 1 out of 4 is facing justice, that's not justice. And we haven't seen it. We saw it in Rodney King. We saw it in many cases where police officers, when they get to the grand jury, when they get to the courtroom, they walk free from the courts. But in Scotland, we don't even have justice, because we've never had a single police officer prosecuted for a racist attack. We're yet to see that. And in the reality, we want to talk about Sheku Bayo, we have a big battle ahead with the public inquiry. We want the courtroom to be filled up. We want people to be standing outside in the streets. And we need support. We need financial support. I mean, we've all been shy about saying that, but my God, do we need it? We are taking on the forces of the state, yet we see nothing. We see absolutely nothing. So, I mean, that's a summary. Excuse my anger, but I think probably reflects a lot of anger that everybody else is also feeling in the speakers and everybody out there on the streets and in the United States or in Scotland and the United Kingdom.
Thanks very much for that, Amar. I think there's obviously vital points in there. There's the hypocrisy of some of our political leaders and social media celebrities, but there's also a very valid critique of the left as well. And if there's ever a time where we have to take that on board very seriously, then it is now. So we will be doing everything that we possibly can in the upcoming public inquiry. We will be doing everything that we possibly can to raise awareness about not just the case of Sheku Bayo, but about the problem that we have with racism in Scotland, because all too often it's tucked under the carpet as if it doesn't exist. Thank you for that, Amar, and we will continue to build in the way that you outline. The last speaker that we have this evening is someone who's already made an appearance on these Contour lectures, and who has inspired many of the people who he spoke to that evening about how to build community organisation, how to build power in a locality. And we thought it would be good to hear once again from Callie Akuno, who is the co-director of the Cooperation Jackson. That's a network of worker cooperatives in Jackson, Mississippi, and a long-time organiser with the Malcolm X grassroots movement. It's a pleasure once again to welcome you, Callie, to many people in Scotland. There are hundreds on the line just now, and we are very much looking forward to your comments as our last speaker of the evening. So over to you, Callie. Just a second or two, you may be on mute. And I've just been told to look at my phone, but there's an update. 1 second. Right. He will be here, in fact, in 2 minutes, which gives me an opportunity to tell you once again about some of the solidarity action that we're planning. We thought it'd be good to, after this meeting, have, I know it's not the biggest thing that we can do, but I think it's something that we can at least attempt to do, is we're going to launch a hashtag which says Solidarity from Scotland. We want that to circulate around the movement in Scotland, the general public. We're going to attach onto that the links to the various community organisations that we want people to give money to. I think we're also going to look at how we can give some funds to the campaigns which Amar has been involved in as well, in light of the comments that he's made from this meeting. So we're going to do that after this meeting. Hashtag Solidarity from Scotland. Everything that has been talked about in this meeting, whether it's who to donate to, the hashtag, will be emailed to you. We're also going to send you a very important notification of an event taking place on Thursday. It's another lecture, and this lecture will be talking in particular about neoliberalism and the authoritarian turn that neoliberalism is taking as a result of it going deeper and deeper into crisis. And of course that relates directly to what's happening just now, not just in the United States, but here in the UK as well, where governments are becoming more authoritarian, where civil liberties are becoming under more and more attack, and where we are going to have to organise to defend those civil liberties and to defend democracy, and indeed to extend it as well. I've just seen Callie has joined the meeting, and I want to reintroduce Callie, and I'm just going to ask if you can hear us at the present moment.
Yeah, I can hear you fine.
It's really good to see you again, and thank you very much for coming along. I've said to all the speakers, we really appreciate your time because we know how busy and intense a period this is. So I'll hand over directly to you just now, Callie. Thanks very much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you guys for pulling this together. Very much needed in this critical time. Sincere apologies for being late, but we are in some somewhat uncharted territory here with the way things are progressing. And I've been on several calls this morning, trying to do really kind of a threat assessment, to be honest with everybody, around to what extent should we take Trump's, threat to declare martial law in the United States serious, which, he kind of teetered on a bit yesterday and played with. So we've been trying to, I think there's folks scrambling all over the United States, trying to figure out what should come next, what can be done next, what should be done next, and to really get a clear read on where he's at, where the governors are at, because those are the two basic forces that can make that kind of call. We know the National Guard has been deployed, I think now in 15 states to kind of buster some of the police forces in a number of different places. But we're really at a critical moment where we just see a lot of fractures in the state, in a number of different directions. the deep divisions, expressed between the Democratic governors and Trump around how to respond. We see some of that, unfortunately, kind of playing itself out in debates within the movement. We haven't really seen anything of this magnitude in the United States since 1968. And I think Trump and the right think that this is a mirror to 1968 in many regards. At least his law and order appeal is very much a copy of what Nixon did in 1968 to kind of propel himself into the presidential office. I think he's banking on trying to play up on this assumption that give me just a quick second. It's how crazy to think. All the masks have been moved over to the CPC. Yeah, because she needed to put, I think it was like 20 masks short. So she needed to put some more inventory over there. So I didn't get a chance from getting off one call to another to let you know that they head over that way. I'll make sure that they gets over to you as soon as I get off this call. Okay, or you can swing back around in about 15 minutes. Either way. Yeah, we moving a mile a minute around this camp. But yeah, I mean, it's historic. I mean, what's taking place is definitely historic. I think it's been over 150 cities now where there's been some actions. I think that's an undercount, to be honest with you all. I'm saying that on the basis of what has occurred here in Mississippi, we've seen some things that we haven't seen before and probably haven't seen at any point since, perhaps since, the Civil War. And that is, there have been a record number of protests that have occurred in a lot of the small white towns in Mississippi. And for there to be, demonstrations, even if it's only 50, 20, 100 people, which some of these have been, that I'm aware of, that's very historic. Because typically, it's been a challenge getting white progressive forces in the eastern part of this state, which is majority white. The western part of the state, where I'm at, is majority black. Mississippi's kind of divided along a fractured line. So everybody's clear that fracture is by kind of like an accident of geography, in that the western part of the state is the part where the Mississippi Delta is, which is the rich, soil that the planters used for their cotton and sugarcane and indigo crops, during the period of chattel slavery, which is what dictates why my folks and my ancestors have been primarily concentrated in the western part of the state. The eastern part of the state is much more hilly, kind of old shell mound layers. So you got more of the poor white working class historically that have been kind of concentrated there. And it's been, for far too long, kind of a bastion of reactionary politics, that's made Mississippi legendary. And for these young white folks to stand up and do these demonstrations in those areas, to me, is one of the most critical breakthroughs that has happened historically in this moment. We've never really seen anything like that. Typically, folks will come to Jackson because it's the political capital, it's the largest city, but it's also by far and away historically the most liberal city. And folks know that they'll kind of get a fair shake and won't get repressed, for speaking up here. So normally those forces will attract here. This time has been much more diffuse, but that politically, consciously, I think is a major shift that I know forces like me have been wanting to see develop, in the United States all of my life. So I think in some respects, regardless of to what extent Trump and the forces allied with him, tried to commit to a program of repressive violence in the near future, I think in the long term, it's not going to work. I think there's been too much of a conscious shift, too much of a conscious break. Them thinking that they can kind of repeat that formula of having the vast majority of white people support, those repressive kind of tactics And that's the politics. I think that day is over. I think they're miscalculating in a critical way. Doesn't mean that things won't get ugly or won't be violent. Because we know the United States government, unfortunately for all of us, can wield a tremendous amount of destructive power once it decides to apply it. But clearly, as we talked about a couple of weeks ago, I think this is just more confirmation. There is no going back to the status quo that existed prior to the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think this is all an indication that progressive forces, I'll call it that, progressive forces are steering for real change and willing to make some critical sacrifices to bring it about. That is what I think we're seeing. I think that is really a deeper part about what I'm calling the Floyd rebellion. I think is what's underscoring it. I think the tipping point, of course, was a black man, being lynched in the way in which he was particularly lynched on camera, and that being caught. I think what was so moving about that was, folks clearly hearing his pleas, calling for his mama, in that particular way. I think that just moved some folks to finally kind of realize and to say, look, enough is enough. We got to do something about that. The way forward, of course, is murky. It's cloudy. It's not completely clear where all this is going to land. I, for one, think that there's a beauty in that because there's a tremendous amount of opportunity for the left to be actively involved with masses in motion to shape that dialogue, contribute to that dialogue, give us some direction. So we shouldn't be afraid. I think this is a moment we have to embrace, and not just in the United States, because I know this is stirring up everywhere right now with a bunch of different catalyst kind of fires. So this is a time for us to really step into history and engage. We have the best ideas, bar none, I would argue, and now it's time to really put them into practice. That is where we're at. That's this historical stage.
That was absolutely brilliant, Callie, and we can see that you're really busy. It's a great access to information and knowledge that we've received here in Scotland from yourself, from Rose, and from everyone who's been on the call. And we want to make sure that knowledge is put to good use. So we are going to build as much solidarity as we can. I mentioned earlier on the call that bringing about international pressure is also something which can play a critical importance. So we'll think of ways that we can do that, and we'll think of ways that we can do that sooner rather than later. We have been running these forums, and generally what we would do is move to breakout groups, but because of the scale of this meeting and the numbers of people on the meeting, we're not going to do that tonight. What I will say though is that on Thursday we're holding a meeting which is looking specifically at why and how neoliberalism is becoming more authoritarian and what we can do about it, how we can best organise and mobilise and resist the turn towards this kind of authoritarian rule. And I think that's going to be something that's really important. So as I say, everyone after this meeting will get an email with a link to sign up for that meeting. There's other things that we want to do as well. I understand that people will have lots of questions. They'll have lots of contributions that they want to raise. This is one of many meetings we'll be putting on, but coauthor is but a small organisation. We're an anti-capitalist group. We have a revolutionary perspective on society. We understand we're going to need to build a big coalition of people around these issues. So what we will do is that we will advertise any events that are coming up in the weeks ahead that pertain towards building solidarity and support. We want to start this evening with a very simple thing that everyone can get involved in. We're asking at 8:30 p.m. this evening if people can tweet out hashtag solidarity from Scotland and put in your tweet the message that you want to send to the people in the United States who are on the front line. Put in your tweet the message that you want to send to the political leaders in Scotland as well. What do we want them to do to show support? How do we raise the issues that AMR has raised this evening as well? We want to build trade union delegations supporting what's going on. It was great to hear from Adam. We want to continue to build that link, so let's stay in touch. And as we move forward, let's remember that I think something that was really important that Callie said there, we don't know where this is going to go, but we do know that if we put all of our efforts into it, then we will have a better chance at coming out with the best possible outcome to the present moment. I think the world is changing. The society is changing right across the world, in fact. And in that sense, we see ourselves very much as being part of an international movement. I think I just want to end by thanking everyone who has taken part in this meeting this evening. Meeting will include links to sign up to our mailing list, to join our WhatsApp group. We want to continue to have these discussions in any way that we can. Once the lockdown ends, we'll look to see how we can bring some in real life expression to the work that we're doing in terms of public meetings and events. And let's get on the streets as well. There's going to be no shortage of issues for us to mobilise around. I'd like to thank all of the speakers once more for your time tonight. We really appreciate it. The knowledge, as I say, will not go to waste, but all of this will also be turned into a podcast. It's all been recorded, so all of that information will get out right across the movement in Scotland, and we will do everything we can to stand by you as we move forward. I think I would like to, if it's possible, unmute everyone, and we can all have a collective round of applause as we and so everyone should be unmuted.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone.
Cheers.
Smart.
Cheers.